Robert Picton. For years, a pig farmer on the outskirts of Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, hosted massive parties at a venue he called Piggy's Palace. Hundreds of people showed up to these events, sometimes close to 2,000 in a single night, including Hells Angels members and even a former mayor of the city. The music was loud, the crowd was rowdy, and everyone in the community knew the place had a rough reputation. So how did a man throwing parties for half the town end up convicted of taking 6 lives, with forensic evidence tying him to the remains of 33 women and a recorded confession that put the number at 49? Nobody was paying attention to Robert Picton back then. He was a pig farmer, plain and simple, operating a 17-acre property at 953 Dominion Avenue with his brother. He came across as disheveled, unsophisticated, the kind of person the community overlooked entirely. That was about to change. Between roughly 1995 and 2002, women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side at an alarming rate. By 2001, at least 65 women had vanished from the neighborhood, an area plagued by addiction and poverty, where many of the missing were sex workers, and a disproportionate number of them were Indigenous. Picton brought women from the downtown east side back to his farm. According to associate testimony presented at trial, he strangled them and then disposed of their remains by feeding them to his pigs and processing them through a meat grinder. Here is what makes this case so difficult to sit with. There were chances to stop him, and every single one was missed. In March of 1997, Picton was charged with the attempted taking of the life of a sex worker named Wendy Lynn Eistetter, who had escaped after he handcuffed and stabbed her on the farm. The charge was stayed in January of 1998 because prosecutors decided her testimony was unreliable. Geographic profiler Detective Kim Rossmo flagged a serial pattern as early as 1998 and later testified that the case could likely have been solved by late 1999 if police had taken the theory seriously. They did not, and the disappearances continued. The break finally came on February 5, 2002, when RCMP officers executing a firearms warrant on the Picton property found personal items belonging to missing women. Picton was arrested on weapons charges on February 7th and charged with 2 counts on February 22nd. What followed became the largest crime scene investigation in Canadian history. Over 21 months, forensic teams sifted through 383,000 cubic yards of soil, collected roughly 200,000 DNA samples, and recovered the remains, or DNA, of 33 women. An undercover RCMP officer placed in Picton's cell recorded him boasting about taking 49 lives and wanting to reach an even 50. Originally charged with 27 counts of first-degree taking of life, Picton was tried on 6 counts beginning January 22, 2007. On December 9th, the jury convicted him of 6 counts of second degree for the lives of Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Ann Wolfe, Georgina Papin, and Marnie Frey. Justice James Williams imposed life with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The Supreme Court of Canada upheld the convictions in 2010, and the Crown stayed the remaining 20 charges that same year. The 2012 Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, chaired by Wally Opal, concluded that police failures were driven by systemic bias against the victims. And no, I am not making that up. An official government inquiry used the word blatant. As of May 31, 2024, Robert Picton is dead. He had become eligible to apply for day parole in February of that year, which sparked national outrage. On May 19th, a fellow inmate at Port Cartier Institution in Quebec attacked him, and Picton died from those injuries 12 days later at the age of 74. The farm is gone, The parties are long over, but the families of dozens of women are still waiting for answers that may never come. For a while after the Picton case broke, it seemed like that kind of failure. The kind where an entire community overlooks a predator hiding in plain sight was something confined to remote farms and marginalized neighborhoods. That assumption did not hold up. Carlton Gary. Between September of 1977 and April of 1978, someone was entering the homes of elderly women in the Winton neighborhood of Columbus, Georgia, one of the most affluent areas in the city. 7 women, ranging in age from 60 to 89, were found strangled in their own bedrooms with nylon stockings knotted around their necks. Doors and windows showed signs of forced entry, but in several cases, the locks appeared undamaged, suggesting the attacker knew how to move through the neighborhood without drawing attention. The press called the perpetrator the Stocking Strangler, and the Winton community, a place where people left their doors unlocked and walked their dogs at night without a second thought, became a neighborhood defined by fear. For 6 years after the last attack, no one knew who he was. How does a man walk into locked homes in a wealthy neighborhood, take 7 lives in 8 months, and then vanish without a trace? Carlton Gary was not from Winton. He had a lengthy criminal record, including a 21-year sentence for armed robbery in New York, from which he escaped in August of 1977, just weeks before the Columbus attacks began. He was mobile, calculated, and familiar with the area from previous burglaries. To the people who lived in Winton, the attacker was a phantom. To law enforcement, he was a case with no leads and no suspect. The victims were Ferna Jackson, Jean Dimenstein, Florence Scheibel, Martha Thurmond, Kathleen Woodruff, Mildred Borum, and Janet Kofer. 2 additional women, Gertrude Miller and Ruth Schwab, survived attacks linked to the same pattern. For 8 months, elderly women living alone in one of Columbus's most established neighborhoods went to bed not knowing if they would wake up. The strangulation stopped abruptly in the spring of 1978. And despite one of the largest investigations in Georgia history at the time, the case went cold. 6 years passed with no arrest. Then, in 1984, a Smith & Wesson pistol stolen from a Winton home during one of the October 1977 break-ins was traced back to Gary. And that was the detail that everyone had missed. He was arrested on May 3, 1984, and indicted the following day on 3 counts each of malice, assault, and burglary for the deaths of Scheibel, Thurmond, and Woodruff. Fingerprints recovered from 4 of the crime scenes matched his. Gary is also suspected in 2 earlier homicides, one in Albany, New York in 1970 and another in Syracuse in 1977. He maintained throughout that an accomplice was responsible for the assaults and the strangulations. But the physical evidence told a different story. On August 26, 1986, the jury convicted him. He was sentenced to death the following day. What came next was more than 2 decades of appeals. In 2004, a federal habeas case examined the evidence in detail. In 2009, just hours before a scheduled execution, the Georgia Supreme Court issued a stay to allow DNA testing. The defense argued that post-trial DNA recovered from a surviving victim's clothing did not match Gary, and that crime lab samples from 2 of the deceased victims had been contaminated. Prosecutors countered that the new evidence would not have changed the verdict. It is worth noting that every appellate court that reviewed this case affirmed the conviction. But the unresolved DNA question has never been fully answered. The defense maintained until the end that the forensic record contained inconsistencies significant enough to raise reasonable doubt, while prosecutors argued that the totality of the evidence particularly the fingerprints at 4 separate crime scenes, left no question about Gary's responsibility. A new execution date was set for March 15, 2018. The Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied clemency the day before. The United States Supreme Court rejected a final stay. Carlton Gary was executed by lethal injection at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison in Jackson and pronounced dead at 10:33 that evening. He was 67 years old. He declined a final statement and a final meal. As of 2026, the case is closed. The stocking strangler file is sealed. But the contested DNA evidence remains a footnote that forensic scholars continue to revisit. But this was not just a problem in small southern cities or rural Canadian farmland. Sometimes the danger lived in an ordinary apartment in an ordinary suburb. And the only person who could identify it was a teenager who refused to stop fighting. Richard Evanitz. On June 24, 2002, a 15-year-old named Kara Robinson was taken at gunpoint from a friend's yard in Lexington County, South Carolina. She was held in her captor's apartment for roughly 18 hours, during which she was subjected to abuse. And then she did something that investigators and criminal profilers still study to this day. While her captor slept, she freed herself from restraints, fled the apartment on foot, flagged down a passing car, and directed police back to the exact location using small details she had memorized during her captivity. Things like a refrigerator magnet from a dentist's office and a serial number printed on a storage container. She was 15 years old, and her composure under unimaginable pressure cracked open a case that had been cold for 6 years. But this story does not start with the escape. It starts with 2 cases in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, that had gone cold for years. Richard Evanitz appeared unremarkable to the people around him. He held jobs, maintained relationships, and lived in apartments where neighbors never reported anything unusual. He had moved from Virginia to South Carolina after the Spotsylvania cases without triggering any law enforcement attention, settling into a life that, from the outside, looked completely ordinary. Beneath that surface, investigators would later discover, was a man responsible for taking the lives of 3 young people in Virginia during the mid-1990s, and quite possibly others that authorities have not yet connected to him. In September of 1996, a young woman named Sophia Silva was taken from her front porch in Spotsylvania County. Her remains were found weeks later in a Hanover County swamp. The following May, 2 sisters, Kristen and Kathy Lisk, were taken from their front yard in the same county. Their remains were recovered from the South Anna River 5 days later. The investigation found evidence of abuse, but no suspect was identified, and the cases remained unsolved for years. Spotsylvania County was left with 2 open files and no answers. The young woman who escaped in South Carolina changed everything. When police arrived at Evanitz's apartment in Columbia, he had already fled. He called his sister Jennifer while driving toward Florida and told her that he had committed more crimes than he could remember. She contacted authorities immediately. Law enforcement tracked him to Sarasota, where a chase ended with spike strips on Bayfront Drive. Surrounded by officers with nowhere left to go, Evanitz took his own life with a handgun on June 27, 2002. He was 38. A search of his apartment recovered newspaper clippings about the Silva and Lisk cases stored inside a footlocker, along with a list of additional prospective victims that suggested he had been planning future abductions. Forensic analysis matched fibers from the restraints used on the South Carolina survivor to fibers found on the remains of all 3 Virginia victims. A handprint belonging to Kristen Lisk was lifted from the inside of Evanitz's car trunk. The physical evidence was overwhelming, and it answered questions that the Spotsylvania County Sheriff's Office had been asking for 6 years. In 3 years, this case would have looked very different. Evanitz was a transient figure who moved between states, changed jobs frequently, and left minimal forensic signatures. He had no prior criminal record that would have flagged him in any database, and no neighbor or coworker ever reported behavior that suggested he was capable of what investigators eventually tied to him. If that teenager had not memorized the details of her surroundings and fought her way out in the middle of the night, investigators might still be searching for the person responsible for the Virginia cases. The survivor, Kara Robinson Chamberlain, went on to become a victim advocate and public speaker. Her story was dramatized in a 2023 Lifetime film. Evanitz's case is considered effectively closed, though additional unsolved cases across Virginia remain under review by authorities who believe his actual number of victims may be higher than 3. Evanitz had a narrow window. He operated for 6 years before a single act of courage brought the whole thing down. But what happens when the system itself gives a predator decades of freedom, not because of evasion, but because of a legal technicality? Coral Eugene Watts. In May of 1982, a man broke into a Houston apartment and attempted to drown a woman named Lori Lister in her bathtub. Her roommate, Melinda Aguilar, had her hands bound but managed to jump from a second-story balcony and scream for help. Both women survived, and the man was arrested. His name was Coral Eugene Watts. So how did a man caught in the act, with a trail of suspected victims stretching across 2 states and possibly into Canada, come within months of walking free? Nobody was paying attention to Watts when the pattern started. His history of violence stretched back to 1974 in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and authorities believe he may have been responsible for more than 80 lives taken across Michigan and Texas between that year and 1982. He targeted women, almost always on Sunday mornings, and later told investigators he attacked those he believed had what he called evil eyes. Confirmed victims include Gloria Steele in Kalamazoo in 1974, Jean Klein in Grosse Pointe Farms in 1979, Helen Dutcher in Ferndale later that same year, and multiple women in the Ann Arbor and Houston areas through 1982. The methods varied. Some were stabbed, others drowned, others strangled. The inconsistency in approach made it difficult to connect the cases across jurisdictions. After the Houston arrest, Harris County Assistant District Attorney Ira Jones offered Watts something almost unheard of: immunity from prosecution in exchange for a full confession. The logic at the time was that without bodies or physical evidence tying Watts to specific cases, a plea deal was the only way to learn where the victims were. Watts pleaded guilty to burglary with intent on September 3, 1982, drew a 60-year sentence, and confessed to 13 takings of life, leading police to burial sites across Texas and Michigan. Michigan prosecutors were furious and refused to participate in the arrangement. And somehow, it gets worse. In 1989, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals found that the trial judge had failed to inform Watts during his plea that water could legally constitute a deadly weapon. The technical nature of the ruling is important. This was not a finding of innocence. It was a procedural error that made Watts eligible for mandatory good time credit, moving his projected release date to May 9, 2006. A man believed responsible for taking dozens of lives was going to walk out of a Texas prison on a technicality. The effort to keep him confined became a race against the calendar. Victim advocate Andy Kahan and Harriet Samander, the mother of Watts's confirmed victim Elena Samander, launched a national publicity campaign beginning in 2002. Michigan Attorney General Mike Cox sought new charges using evidence that had not been covered by the Texas immunity deal. The breakthrough came when eyewitness Joseph Foy came forward identifying Watts as the man he had seen attacking Helen Dutcher in Ferndale in 1979. On November 17, 2004, a Michigan jury convicted Watts of Dutcher's taking of life, and he was sentenced to life without parole on December 7th. A second Michigan trial in Kalamazoo in the summer of 2007 convicted him in the 1974 death of Gloria Steele, adding a second life term. Texas appellate courts later rejected his double jeopardy claims. Watts never saw freedom. He died of prostate cancer on September 21, 2007, at Foote Hospital in Jackson, Michigan, while serving his sentence at Ionia Maximum Correctional Facility. He was 53. As of 2026, the full scope of Watts's crimes remains unknown. He claimed responsibility for as many as 100 lives, but confirmed convictions stand at 3. The immunity deal that nearly freed him is still cited in legal textbooks as one of the most controversial plea arrangements in American criminal history. The Watts case came down to a legal technicality and a desperate last-minute effort to keep a dangerous man behind bars. But the idea that the system itself could release someone it knew to be a threat, that would come back in another case just a few years later, with consequences that proved fatal. David Moust. In late November of 2003, a property owner in Hammond, Indiana named Randy Loubier went into the basement of a building on Highland Street to assess some needed repairs. He noticed patches of fresh concrete on the floor that he had not authorized. He contacted police. When investigators broke through the concrete, they found the remains of a 13-year-old. 2 more victims, ages 16 and 19, were recovered in the days that followed. The tenant who had poured that concrete was a man named David Moust. And the worst part of this story is not what he did in that basement. It is that the system had been warned, repeatedly, that this was exactly what would happen if he was released. Moust's history of harming young people stretched back 3 decades and crossed multiple state lines. In 1974, while serving as a United States Army cook stationed in Frankfurt, West Germany, he took the life of a young person. A military court convicted him of manslaughter, and he served 4 years. In 1981, in Elgin, Illinois, another young person was harmed fatally, his body found in a quarry. Moust was charged in 1982 after being extradited from Texas, where he was already serving time for an attack on a teenager in Galveston County. The Illinois case dragged through the courts for over a decade. Moust was initially found unfit to stand trial. He eventually pleaded guilty in 1994 and received a 35-year sentence. With credit for roughly 17 years already served, he was released in June of 1999. The decision to let him go remains one of the most scrutinized failures in Indiana-Illinois corrections history. A Cook County prosecutor had described Moust in writing as most likely the most dangerous inmate they would ever house. Moust himself wrote a 5-page letter to corrections officials asking them not to release him, stating plainly that he would harm again. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Both warnings were ignored, and Moust walked out of an Illinois state facility with no monitoring, no restrictions, and no communication between the state of Illinois and the communities where he would go on to live. 4 years later, 3 teenagers in Hammond, Indiana were dead. Michael Dennis, James Regani, and Nicholas James had been lured to Moust's second-floor apartment at 2441 Highland Street, where he took their lives. He then encased their remains in concrete in the basement below. The scope of what investigators found when they broke through that floor was staggering. Randy Loubier's discovery led to Moust's arrest on December 12, 2003. The Hammond community was stunned. Moust had been living on Highland Street, interacting with neighbors and local teenagers for years, and nobody in the area had any idea about his criminal history or the warnings that had followed him from state to state. Avoiding the death penalty, Moust pleaded guilty in late 2005 to all 3 Hammond cases. On December 9th, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Lake County prosecutor Bernard Carter publicly blamed the state of Illinois for releasing Moust in 1999, calling the failure a preventable catastrophe. On January 19, 2006, the same day he was informed of his transfer to the Indiana Department of Corrections, Moust took his own life in his Lake County jail cell. He was 51. A note recovered from the cell contained a confession to 5 total takings of life and an apology to the families of his victims. The case prompted the passage of Indiana Code Section 1188 in 2006, creating a violent offender registry designed to prevent the kind of systemic failure that allowed Moust to cycle through multiple states and multiple sentences without anyone connecting the pattern. The law requires that correction systems in Indiana track and share information about violent offenders across jurisdictions. The exact kind of communication that might have saved 3 lives in Hammond if it had existed 4 years earlier. As of 2026, David Moust's case remains one of the starkest examples of what happens when a criminal justice system is warned about a specific individual in writing by both prosecutors and the individual himself, and still fails to act. The families of Michael Dennis, James Regagni, and Nicholas James live with the knowledge that their losses were not just foreseeable. They were foreseen. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Cleophas Prince Jr. In January of 1990, a 20-year-old woman named Tiffany Paige Schultz was found in her San Diego apartment. She had been stabbed to death. Over the next 8 months, 5 more women across the Claremont and University City neighborhoods would meet the same fate. All of them attacked in their own homes, most of them during broad daylight. That was January. By September, 6 women were dead. San Diego police were running the largest manhunt in the city's history, and the attacker was still out there. It was the fall of 1989, and Cleophas Prince Jr. was a United States Navy sailor stationed in San Diego. He had been court-martialed for larceny in October of that year and recommended for discharge. 2 months later, he moved into the Buena Vista Gardens apartment complex, and from the outside, he looked like just another young man starting over after a setback. He held a gym membership at a health club on Miramar Road. He had a girlfriend. He blended in. The 6 women he is convicted of taking the lives of were Tiffany Paige Schultz, 20, Janine Marie Weinhold, 21, Holly Suzanne Tarr, 18, Alyssa Naomi Keller, 38, and Pamela Gail Clark, 42, along with her 18-year-old daughter Amber. The attacks shared a pattern. Most occurred during the day in unlocked or easily accessed apartments. Several of the victims had recently bathed. Holly Tarr was visiting her brother at the Buena Vista Gardens complex, the same complex where Prince himself lived. Alyssa Keller lived near Kalina Park Terrace, close to an apartment Prince had recently moved into. He was not traveling across the city to find victims. He was operating in his own neighborhood, walking distance from the places he slept and ate, and went about his daily routine. Investigators developed a composite sketch after a maintenance worker spotted a man near Holly Tarr's apartment on the day of her death. But the sketch alone was not enough to make an arrest. The Claremont neighborhood was rattled. Women living alone in the area reported changing their locks, moving in with friends, and avoiding their apartments during the day. San Diego police assigned dozens of officers to the case. But for nearly a year after the final attack, no arrest came. The break arrived in February of 1991. Prince followed a woman home from his health club in the Scripps Ranch neighborhood and attempted to break into her residence. She heard him and called for help. Witnesses in the area recorded his license plate. He was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, and extradited to San Diego. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything. DNA recovered from blood at multiple crime scenes matched Prince. A gold nugget ring belonging to Alyssa Keller and a ring belonging to Holly Tarr were traced directly to him. Tarr's ring had been given to his girlfriend. His roommate testified that Prince had come home with bloody jeans and spoken openly about the stabbings. FBI agent William Hagmeyer and profiler Larry Ankrum testified that the same individual was responsible for all 6 takings of life. On July 13, 1993, Prince was convicted on 6 counts of first degree, along with 21 additional felony counts. The evidence presented at trial included the DNA matches, the stolen jewelry, the roommate's testimony, and FBI profiling analysis that tied all 6 cases to a single offender. The jury recommended death. Judge Charles R. Hayes formally imposed the death sentence on November 5, 1993. The California Supreme Court upheld the conviction and sentence in 2007 after a lengthy appellate process. As of 2026, Cleophas Prince Jr. remains under a death sentence in California. Governor Gavin Newsom's 2019 executive order imposed a moratorium on executions statewide, and under a 2024 initiative, condemned inmates were transferred from San Quentin to other high-security facilities within the California Department of Corrections system. Prince was 58 in 2025. He has not been executed, and given the moratorium, there is no scheduled date. The same detail that caught Prince, a license plate number jotted down by an alert neighbor, was the kind of small, accidental evidence that solved many of these cases. But in Houston in the early 1970s, there was no alert neighbor. There was no tip line. There was a man handing out candy to children in the Heights, and for 3 years, nobody questioned it. Dean Corll. For years, the children in Houston Heights knew Dean Corll as the Candyman. He had worked in his family's candy factory and made a habit of giving free sweets to the neighborhood kids. He was generous, friendly, and seemed to go out of his way for young people in the area. What nobody knew at the time was that between September of 1970 and August of 1973, Corll was responsible for the abduction and taking of the lives of at least 28 young people, making it, at the time of its discovery, the worst case of serial harm in American history. Corll's reputation as a generous neighbor would later become the exact thing that made the case so difficult to detect. In the Heights, a working-class neighborhood in northwest Houston, he was the Candyman, a familiar face, somebody parents trusted enough to allow their children to spend time around. He used that access to lure young people to his home with offers of parties, alcohol, and rides. And once they were inside, he harmed them. The scope of what investigators eventually uncovered was staggering in both its scale and its duration. He did not act alone. 2 teenagers, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., assisted him over the course of the 3-year period. Court records established that Corll paid them to bring victims to his home, sometimes offering up to $200 per person. The arrangement continued without detection, largely because many of the victims came from transient or unstable home situations, and their disappearances were not always reported or investigated with urgency. In the Houston Heights of the early 1970s, a missing teenager did not always generate the same response that a missing child from a wealthier neighborhood would have. Some families filed reports that went nowhere. Others assumed their children had simply run away. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The case ended on August 8, 1973, inside Coral's residence at 2020 Lamar Street in Pasadena, Texas. During a gathering at the house, Coral restrained Henley along with two other teenagers, Tim Curley and Rhonda Williams. Henley convinced Coral to release him. He then took Coral's own firearm and ended Coral's life with 6 shots. He called police immediately afterward. The clock had been ticking on this case for 3 years. Henley stopped it. What followed was one of the largest body recovery operations in United States history at that time. Henley directed investigators to 3 separate burial sites: a boat storage shed in southwest Houston, where 17 remains were recovered, a wooded area near Lake Sam Rayburn, and a stretch of beach at High Island. In total, the remains of at least 27 young people were found in 1973. Forensic anthropologist Sharon Derrick later confirmed the total at no fewer than 30, and identification efforts have continued for decades since. Henley was convicted of 6 takings of life in July of 1974 and sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year terms. That conviction was overturned on appeal in December of 1978. He was retried in June of 1979, convicted again on 6 counts, and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. He was never charged for ending Coral's life, as the act was ruled self-defense. David Owen Brooks was convicted in March of 1975 for 1 taking of life and received a life sentence. Brooks died of COVID-related complications in a Galveston hospital on May 28, 2020. He was 65. As of 2026, Elmer Wayne Henley remains incarcerated at the Telford Unit in Bowie County, Texas. He was most recently denied parole on November 7, 2025, with the next review set for November of 2035. He has filed multiple appeals and a compassionate release request, all of which have been denied. A 2022 request for compassionate release was also rejected. One victim from the boat shed has still never been identified. Forensic anthropologist Sharon Derrick and journalist Lisa Olson, whose book on the case was published in 2025, continue their work to name the remaining dead. The Coral case belonged to the 1970s, but the pattern it exposed did not stay there. More than 2 decades later, in an affluent suburb north of Indianapolis, a nearly identical dynamic was unfolding behind the gates of a sprawling estate. And nobody in the family or the community had any idea. Herbert Baumeister. Herbert Baumeister was the founder of the Save-A-Lot thrift store chain in Indianapolis, a married father of 3 who lived with his family on an 18-acre estate called Fox Hollow Farm in Westfield, Indiana. He was a successful businessman in a $1 million suburban home with a wife and children who loved him. Neighbors knew the family as quiet and respectable. Juliana Baumeister later said the couple had been intimate only 6 times during their entire marriage, and that she had never seen her husband without clothing. At least, that is what everyone around him believed about the life he was living. Nobody in Baumeister's circle saw what was happening at Fox Hollow Farm. Between roughly 1980 and 1996, investigators believe he took the lives of at least 25 men, most of them lured from gay bars in downtown Indianapolis. The victims were drawn from a community that, in the 1980s and early 90s, was largely marginalized and whose missing members were not always prioritized by law enforcement. Baumeister is also the primary suspect in the I-70 strangler cases, a series of at least 11 takings of life along Interstate 70 in Indiana and Ohio between 1980 and 1991. Authorities formally named him as the prime suspect in those highway cases in April of 1999. The first real warning came in 1993, when a man known in police reports as Tony Harris survived a near strangulation by someone calling himself Brian Smart at a bar in Indianapolis. 2 years later, Harris spotted the same man again, followed him to his car, and recorded the license plate. It traced back to Baumeister. A separate alarm had already sounded inside the Baumeister household itself. In late 1994, Baumeister's son Eric, who was 13 at the time, found a human skull and partial skeleton in the woods on the Fox Hollow property. Baumeister told his wife Juliana that the bones belonged to a medical skeleton from his father's anesthesiology practice. Juliana accepted that explanation. That was a warning sign, and it was missed. Juliana initially refused to give police permission to search the property. After filing for divorce in January of 1996 and Baumeister moving out to a lake house, she finally consented on June 24th of that year. What investigators found on the grounds of Fox Hollow Farm changed the entire scale of the case. More than 10,000 charred and crushed bone fragments were recovered, along with remnants of handcuffs and shotgun shells. Initial analysis identified the remains of 11 men. 8 were named by 1999. Johnny Bayer, Richard Hamilton, Stephen Hale, Alan Broussard, Jeffrey Jones, Manuel Resendez, Roger Goodlett, and Michael Kieran. Baumeister never stood trial. With a warrant pending, he fled to Ontario, Canada. On July 3, 1996, he took his own life with a firearm at Pinery Provincial Park in Grand Bend, Ontario. He was 49. A 3-page note recovered from the scene referenced his failing marriage and his business troubles. He made no mention of the remains found at Fox Hollow Farm. And no, I am not making that up. A 3-page farewell and not a single word about what was buried on his property. As of 2026, identification efforts at Fox Hollow Farm continue. Hamilton County Coroner Jeff Jellison reopened the work in 2022 with the help of Othram Incorporated, the Indiana State Police Lab, and the University of Indianapolis. Alan Livingston was identified in October of 2023. Manuel Resendez was reconfirmed in January of 2024. Daniel Thomas Halloran was identified later that same year, bringing the total confirmed identifications to 10. Investigators still have DNA profiles for at least 3 unidentified victims. A memorial was dedicated at Hamilton Memorial Park Cemetery on August 29, 2024. Jellison has described the case as the second largest investigation into unidentified human remains in the country, second only to the World Trade Center. Up to this point, every case in this video has followed a recognizable pattern. A predator blends into a community, neighbors fail to notice, and the investigation begins only after the damage is done. The next case flips that sequence entirely. Here, investigators were searching actively for years, and the reason they could not find the right person had nothing to do with a lack of evidence. It had to do with a profile that pointed them in the wrong direction. Derek Todd Lee. Between 1998 and 2003, 7 women in southern Louisiana were found dead under circumstances that pointed to the same attacker. The violence was extreme, and the forensic evidence was consistent across multiple scenes. A multi-agency homicide task force formed in 2002, with FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit support and access to DNA from several crime scenes. The Baton Rouge community was on edge. Women living alone near the LSU campus changed their routines. Local news coverage was relentless. Then, in March of 2003, a single lab result from a company in Florida redirected the entire investigation overnight. How does a task force with federal resources, physical evidence from multiple locations, and thousands of interviews spend years searching for the wrong person? The answer was the profile. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit initially assessed the offender as a white male between 25 and 35 years old. Based on that assessment, police DNA tested thousands of white men across the Baton Rouge area. None of them matched. The actual perpetrator, Derek Todd Lee, an African-American man living in Zachary, Louisiana with a history of peeping and prowling complaints, was not on the radar. He blended into the community the way so many of these men did, described by those around him as a smooth talker, a married man, someone whose neighbors never connected him to the headlines dominating local news. Lee had prior contacts with law enforcement, but nothing that elevated him to the task force's attention while the profile pointed elsewhere. The 7 confirmed victims were Randy Mabrewer, 28, Gina Wilson Green, 41, Geraldine Barr DeSoto, 21, Charlotte Murray Pace, 22, Pam Kinamore, 44, Trinisha Dean Collum, 23, and Carrie Lynn Yoder, 26. The attacks spanned 5 years and multiple parishes. Charlotte Murray Pace was stabbed more than 80 times. Pam Kinamore's throat was cut. The violence was deliberate and escalating with each case. The turning point came when a Florida laboratory called DNA Print Genomics reanalyzed the crime scene DNA in March of 2003 and determined that the genetic markers were consistent with an African-American male. The task force pivoted immediately. Survivor Diane Alexander, who had fought off an attacker in Breaux Bridge in July of 2002 when her son interrupted the assault, provided a description. The resulting sketch matched a known Zachary suspect. Police obtained a voluntary DNA sample from Lee on May 5, 2003. It matched evidence recovered from all 7 crime scenes. Lee fled to Atlanta. He was arrested on May 27, 2003, by the Atlanta Police Department Fugitive Squad in the Polar Rock neighborhood after a 5-day manhunt. His trial moved quickly. On August 10, 2004, a West Baton Rouge Parish jury convicted him of second degree for the taking of Geraldine DeSoto's life, carrying a mandatory life sentence. 2 months later, on October 12th, an East Baton Rouge Parish jury convicted him of first degree for the taking of Charlotte Murray Pace's life. The jury deliberated for approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes before recommending death. Lee was sent to Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola on October 14, 2004. Lee had chronic heart disease and a pacemaker. On January 16, 2016, he was hospitalized at Lane Memorial Hospital in Zachary. He died 5 days later, on January 21st, at the age of 47, before his appeals were exhausted. The West Feliciana Parish coroner ruled the cause of death as heart disease. As of 2026, the Lee case is considered a landmark in forensic science and a cautionary example in criminal profiling. The DNA print genomics analysis that broke it open is now taught in forensic programs nationwide, and the case is frequently cited in discussions about the limitations of behavioral profiling when applied to serial offenders. The National Institute of Justice featured the investigation in episode 24 of their Just Science podcast in 2022, with an interview with forensic scientist Ray Wickenheiser about the role of DNA ancestry analysis in redirecting the manhunt. The Lee case proved that forensic science could rescue even a badly misdirected investigation. DNA ancestry analysis did in days what behavioral profiling had failed to do in years. But decades earlier, in Atlanta, a different kind of forensic evidence, fiber analysis, had been used to close one of the most devastating cases in American history. And the question of whether it was enough has never fully gone away. Wayne Williams. Between the summer of 1979 and the spring of 1981, at least 29 young people, predominantly young African-American males, were found dead across the Atlanta metropolitan area. The cases became known collectively as the Atlanta child murders. And for nearly 2 years, the city lived under a kind of fear that reshaped daily life in entire neighborhoods. Parents kept children indoors after school. Community patrol groups formed on residential streets. Curfews went into effect. The FBI joined the investigation on June 22, 1980. And a dedicated task force was established on November 17th of that year. The investigation produced thousands of leads, but no arrest for almost 2 years. And the toll on Atlanta's African-American community was profound. The investigative strategy that ultimately identified a suspect centered on fiber evidence. Crime lab analysts identified an unusual yellow-green nylon fiber on several of the victims, and traced it to a specific type of carpet manufactured by West Point Pepperell. Statistical analysis estimated that only 1 in roughly 7,792 housing units in the Atlanta area contained that carpeting. It was an extraordinarily rare match, and it became the backbone of the prosecution. After a newspaper published details about the fiber connection, the pattern of body disposal shifted. Remains began appearing in the Chattahoochee River, suggesting the person responsible was adapting to the public reporting on the investigation. Police set up surveillance on bridges crossing the river. At approximately 2:50 in the morning on May 22, 1981, officers stationed on the James Jackson Parkway Bridge heard a loud splash in the water below. The next vehicle to leave the bridge was a white 1970 Chevrolet station wagon, driven by Wayne Williams, a 23-year-old freelance music promoter and aspiring talent scout living with his parents in Northwest Atlanta. He told officers he was on his way to audition as singer. Investigators later determined that no such person existed. 2 days after the bridge incident, the body of Nathaniel Cater, 27, was recovered downstream. Williams was arrested on June 21, 1981, and his trial began in Fulton County Superior Court in early 1982. The prosecution's case rested primarily on forensic fiber and hair evidence, linking Williams' home, his car, and his family's German Shepherd to material found on 12 victims. The 2 he was formally charged with taking the lives of, and 10 additional pattern victims admitted under Georgia's similar transactions rule. The rare West Point Pepperell carpet fibers were the centerpiece of the state's argument. After approximately 12 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Williams on February 27, 1982, of taking the lives of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, 21. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The Atlanta Police Department subsequently closed 22 of the related cases and attributed them to Williams, though none of those cases were ever tried separately. Williams has maintained his innocence from the day of his arrest. His defense team has pointed to potential involvement by the Ku Klux Klan, citing a recorded 1981 conversation in which an informant named Charles T. Sanders spoke approvingly of the cases. That informant was cleared by polygraph. A 2015 Department of Justice review found that FBI hair analysis techniques used during the original trial period may not have met professional standards, though prosecutors maintained that hair evidence was a minor component of the overall case, and that the fiber evidence alone was sufficient. In March of 2019, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and Police Chief Erica Shields ordered retesting of physical evidence. Modern DNA testing on a subset of the evidence has been described as consistent with Williams, or not excluding him, which is neither definitively incriminating nor exonerating. As of 2026, those results have not produced exoneration. It is important to note that Williams was convicted of 2 takings of adult lives. The 22 additional cases attributed to him by the Atlanta Police Department were closed administratively and have never been tried in court. That distinction remains a source of ongoing legal and public debate. As of 2026, Wayne Williams is 67 years old and incarcerated at Telfair State Prison in Georgia. The Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied parole in November of 2019, citing insufficient time served, and imposed the maximum allowable 8-year set-off. His next parole consideration is scheduled for November of 2027. In every case covered here, the person responsible was someone the community already knew. They were the farmer, the businessman, the sailor, the candy man. And in every case, the warning signs were there long before anyone thought to look for them. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.